Welcome back. As we discussed in our last lecture, the manner in which we report qualitative data analysis really needs to have a firm foundation in our data, and that's the science of what a good researcher does. But there's also an art to reporting, and a lot of what qualitative researchers need to consider is not just the format for what they're preparing, but also how the audience or end users of the data are going to want those data to be packaged so they can get the most out of them. Sometimes this even means creating multiple layers of reports. But considering your audience is a really important part of creating any sort of reporting tool. And one of the things that we as marketing researchers need to be particularly sensitive to is the type of audience that we're preparing a report for. Many managers and executives just don't have time for a lot of depth and detail. They want to get right down to the insights. But many frontline staff and mid level managers are more interested in depth, detail, and nuance because they want to understand how the data pertain to their own experience and perceptions. They tend to have a stronger appetite for more in depth report that they can review. My own experience has taught me that the audience for research often tends to have a higher need for detail at the lower levels of an organization and tends to have less interest in that detail as things move up towards the executive leadership and board level. So, when we're talking about employees that are frontline or ground level, often you need a high level of detail because they're going to be scrutinizing the data and looking for things that line up with their own experience. And so providing folks at that level with a full research report that includes your method and purpose, your key findings, your conclusions, your recommendations, and appendices of data is really useful. Now, in many organizations, they won't share all of that information. They're often afraid to. But if you at least can prepare it so it can be available, a lot of times that is the audience that really craves and eats up those data and also that will try to use those data in other future decisions that they're making. Mid-level management is another group that needs a high level of detail. They're typically the ones that are commissioning or utilizing research. And a lot of times, what they need is something that starts off with top line reporting or initial findings, plus a full research report. So, mid level managers often don't have time to wait around for a full report to be written before decisions need to start to be made. So, getting them something quick and top line and preliminary can help them to begin making decisions and also to be ready for what the full data have to say when they get a full research report. When you get to department heads, the people that are above the mid level managers, they generally don't want to read everything. Sometimes they do, but often they have more of a medium level of detail that they're really looking for. They like the top line reports, those preliminary findings, and they also like to have executive summaries or infomedia like infographics. They may also request a full research report and eventual presentation deck so that they can continue to review and utilize the data, but they may not use all of that. They may use it more as reference or they may delegate it down to other folks to look into. When you get up to the C suite, where you have the CEO, the CMO, the VP of marketing, the CFO, those folks, there's generally a desire for a medium to low level of detail and more synthesis. Generally, providing some kind of executive summary or brief infomedia like an infographic is highly desired. And then providing a report as kind of a supplement to all of that, um, along with a presentation, is definitely something that they tend to like at that level and tend to request a lot more often than they request reading a full written report. When you get up to a board or advisory committee, a group of people that are basically helping to oversee an organization, they tend to want a low level of detail. They want to be able to hear the findings and the conclusions and the recommendations that are being made, but usually an executive summary is more than enough for them, and maybe an infographic or some other type of media. They're certainly going to want to hear a presentation, which we'll talk about later in this series. But in terms of the reporting, they generally don't need a whole lot of information. So along with all of that, here are some other general guidelines to follow when you're writing reports. So a few things to do. One is include as much relevant data as you can in your appendices and provide your clients with a wealth of available information. We always want to make sure that as much of our data as possible goes into the appendix to our report so that if it needs to be referenced, it's easy for people to find. And that should not only reflect the raw data that you collected, but also any analyses that you conducted on those data. And if you transform the data so much that they don't match the raw data anymore, sometimes it's a good idea to include both the raw data in their unprocessed form and then the analyses that you've also conducted. It's also a good idea to organize your analysis and key findings into research objectives so that they can be addressed individually. And whether you're using research objectives or research questions as your organizing format, whatever you do, just making sure that you put your data in a systematic format that can be easily understood, of where the data map to what you were trying to learn in the study can be helpful. It's pretty conventional a lot of times to present qualitative data in the order that it was collected in a survey or other kinds of tool, but that's not always a useful way for actually looking at the data once you're at the reporting and analysis stage. So sometimes putting it into objectives and research questions instead makes a lot more sense. Do also try to provide as definitive an answer as possible to the research problem. This is not always easy to do with qualitative research, because a lot of times qualitative research is exploratory. And so you're not able to provide a real definitive answer to what was learned, and you may even have to recommend some other methods of research to follow up with. But do your best to provide what you can. Just don't go beyond the data. Don't say things that don't have a foundation in what you really learned. But try your best to bring things together, stitch them together to find some synthesis so you can help to solve that problem. It makes the research a lot more valuable. Also, make extensive use of quotes and respondent or participant language. The more that you can really take what you heard in the research and apply it to your end users' understanding of what they are hearing from the research in terms of the synthesis and analysis you present, the better it's going to tie together, and they're going to feel like there's validity to what was said in the research and also to what's being concluded about it. Also, provide guidance on next steps for further research. It's usually a good idea. It's kind of self-serving, but a good idea to tell clients, okay, now you have these data, here's what you need to do next. A very traditional recommendation is to recommend quantitative validation. You have these qualitative insights. Now it's time to go out and validate them quantitatively with a random sample to make sure that they hold up. Or maybe you want to recommend other forms of qualitative research. That could be really useful. Or maybe you want to recommend building experience metrics or using some kind of satisfaction measure or likelihood to recommend or other things like that. Whatever it is, make sure it pertains to helping to build out from the research problem that you were trying to address, but also is a natural outgrowth of the data that you collected. It's also important to be upfront about the limitations of qualitative research and not embarrassed by them. So one thing that many qualitative researchers don't do very well, in my experience and based on what I've heard from other folks that have used a lot of qualitative research, is articulate what the limitations of qualitative data are. And it's okay to say up front, this is a qualitative study, which means that the findings are directional. They're not in any way able to be quantitatively used. We have to accept that we may have some bias and we may have some small sample size issues and things like that. But here's what we do have as a result of having this study, and then articulating what you can do with the data. Making sure that people understand what you can and can't do with data is part of the job of a researcher. And so don't be embarrassed by it. In fact, I would say up front, before you even begin doing the study, make sure the limitations are understood and known by the people that are going to be using the data, so that if they need to come to your defense, they can say, yeah, this is what we hired them to do. It helps to make sure that the research is accepted better in the organization. In terms of guidelines for what you shouldn't do, don't include hard to read transcripts or difficult to understand data entry forms unless those are specifically requested. So those may be the tools that you used in analysis, but transcripts are really hard to read when they're not cleaned up. And a lot of times they are next to useless to put into an appendix. And data entry forms that were used for observational or ethnographic exercises or for other types of data that you were collecting, like maybe nonverbal data and things like that, if you don't clean them up and make them palatable to a non-research audience, they're, again, not of a lot of use to have included in the report. So don't put them in there unless there's a purpose for them. But if you do put them in there, make sure you put them in a format that it's easy to understand and read. Also, don't write a lengthy academic style paper on your findings that's hard for your end users to read. So we talked about how one of the things that you can do is you could write up an article or a paper as opposed to a written report. And that's fine if that's the audience that you're trying to gear your research towards. But if you are writing for an audience that is non-researcher and that is going to be trying to use these data and use the insights from these data to make decisions, don't write a paper in that format. Write something that's much more useful and readable and that avoids as much jargon and difficult research language as possible and tries to contextualize things and put them in terms they can understand. It will help not only improve the quality of your reporting, but it will also help the people that are reading your report to get a lot more out of the process. Also, don't shroud your findings in too much nuance. We researchers love nuance because we look at all of these different things that we learn from these studies and we want to dive deep and remember every single individual that we spoke to and think carefully about why people behave in certain ways. And that's really interesting, but it's also not tremendously useful in a study like this. So be careful that you don't go too far down the rabbit hole of nuance when you're talking about your findings. Also, don't solely summarize data with your own pithy interpretations. So if you're going to summarize data, look for themes, look for categories, look for things that come up which are common and which express what many people within your research said. Don't just try to find cutesy little ways to sum things up or cliches to use or expressions to use that maybe make things easier to understand, but which don't really represent what the data had to say. First of all, we will always want to tie our interpretations back to the data. So we need to be accountable to that. But also, it just makes things seem like they're not very rigorous or robust when you present them that way. If you're summarizing everything in formats that are easy to read, but which are not really true to what the data had to say, a lot of times your end users aren't going to get much out of the research process. Also, don't be afraid to say your research is inconclusive if it truly is. This happens in research sometimes. We have inconclusive data. And you should always look for the silver lining, of course. Always try to help your client to understand why having an inconclusive study is still a good thing, because sometimes what it points to is that the problem that they were looking for is not really a problem, right? But don't be afraid to say that. Don't try to fit your data to their problem. Try to solve their problem with your data. And if your data cannot help solve their problem, maybe you need to do a different approach. Maybe you need to reframe the questions that are being asked. Maybe the question that they're asking isn't correct, and the problem that they think is there doesn't exist. And so it's okay to tell them that. Also, don't provide conclusions or recommendations that go outside of your research. It's okay to say, if you're asked a question that you can't answer from your data, to say, I don't have the data to answer that. You can then even further say, if I wanted to speculate, here's what I might suggest based on my experience. But always differentiate what you're saying as a result of your data and what you're saying as a result of your experience, because they are two different things. And if you say something with authority that suggests to your research audience that it came from your data, and it's not really there, they are going to hold you accountable for that and be skeptical, and rightly so, of what you have to say elsewhere about the data because you didn't keep yourself grounded in what the data had to say. Now, before you go out and write a qualitative report, it's a good idea to also think about some data visualization tools that you might be able to utilize to enhance your reporting. And we're going to cover that in the next lecture.